All right. So apologies to those of you who aren't live in class. I started the recording a little bit late. I gave just an overview of what we're going to talk about, but we're launching into the actual content of the class now, so you haven't missed much. Okay, so we're going to start with how we got here in terms of the environmental policy structures that we have at this point in time. If we can get this to advance. Okay. So in the early 20th century, there was basically a precedent of no environmental regulations of any kind, right? So we were in the middle of a industrial revolution, which was bringing urbanization, bringing industrial activity to the country, to many parts of the world, in the U.S. and Europe in particular. And so, you know, we were running into a lot of the consequences of having lots of people living close together, driving cars for the first time, burning fossil fuels to conduct industrial activities. We also had you know, a real crisis in terms of infectious disease. And so this is an image of typhoid fever inoculations in a rural area in the 1930s. And so, you know, these origins really trace back. So the sort of organized public environmental health efforts. There was a sanitary movement in the 19th century. At the very, very end of the 1700s, in 1799, the city of Boston established the Board of Health in response to cholera outbreaks. Paul Revere was actually the commissioner of the Board of Health. In 1805, New York City established the Board of Health in response to yellow fever. So you can see sort of these infectious diseases as some of the big drivers. You know, sort of these different origins. For example, in the 1950s, conducting the sanitary survey in Massachusetts that provided the basis for early public health programs and led to the first state Board of Health. So here's some, you know, early, you know, propaganda, PSAs that are promoting the benefits of privies, basically latrines, toilets. You know, these state and local public health departments, so they're really at the local level, right, we're responsible for environmental health issues. And those issues really focused on sanitation, on protecting drinking water, on sewage, a little bit on control of air pollution, and then some food safety. And so during this time, the federal government, right, the US government has very limited involvement in environmental quality, mostly focused on natural resource management, regulating interstate commerce and infrastructure. And the regulatory role was more limited to things that people were ingesting. So Food and Drug Administration, for example, Department of Agriculture. Okay, so this is a little bit of a quiz. So this is a quote from an American president. The great question of this decade is, shall we surrender to our surroundings or shall we make peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, our land, and our water? Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all the people of America. Anyone want to guess who this president talking about saying the word reparations might have been? Yeah. Okay, Roosevelt. They're not actually talking about racial reparations here. I just think it's funny that that word appears in this quote. Okay, it wasn't Roosevelt. Yeah. Nope, not neither of the Roosevelts. Yeah. Not Kennedy. One more guess. Lexi, do you know?
Oh, and I was going to say
Glenn said Richard Nixon. Glenn's right. So I had a quiz up here. but I just gave it away. It was Nixon. The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings or make peace with nature? Okay, so this was in the State of the Union in 1970. We've read Silent Spring, right? And that was published in 1962. And her work was sort of part of this movement that led to widespread attention to uh, the consequences, really, of sort of letting industry run rampant and having no regulation. Here was another really notable example. We had a river that was on fire. So in Cuyahoga, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was so polluted that it caught on fire actually multiple times. And this is the mayor, Carl Stokes, who was, calling attention to the really dire state of the water quality in this area and the need for taking action to address it. So in April of 1970, again, there was sort of this watershed moment in environmental action. So this was our first Earth Day, founded by Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson, and it was co-chaired by Republican Congressman Pete McCloskey. So I think a really key thing to highlight is at its origins, the environmental movement was very bipartisan. That was sort of widely agreed and accepted that conditions were unacceptable and that it was time to take action to address them. So under the Nixon administration, there's several pieces of very, very important actions. The EPA was established. Various different programs that sort of existed in different places were now brought under, sort of one roof and into that one agency. This is the first administrator of the EPA talking about a new integrated approach to the environmental crisis, not dealing with one segment of the problem, but having a coordinating attack, talking about the need for research, standard setting, monitoring, and enforcement. This awesome obligation to protect and improve our environment. Our country is awakened. We must channel this newfound awareness to constructive action for a better and cleaner America. And so the 70s are really known as the environmental decade. If we look at all of these foundational environmental policies from the National Environmental Protection Act, Clean Air and Clean Water Act that we'll talk about, the Safe Drinking Water Act, fuel economy standards, forest management, all of these different things, all of this was accomplished during the 1970s. And, this then raised this question. So as I said at the outset, it was really those local public health agencies, local and in some cases state boards of health that were in charge. By the time we then start this federal action, this now means that there's sort of different, different organizations that are in charge at different levels. So at the federal level, there's over a dozen major agencies, each with numerous different programs. And often what the federal level does is set minimum standards for environmental quality. So everyone across the country has to, reach a level of air quality that is at least this, right? States and local levels then are mandated to comply with and enforce those federal minimum standards. So the federal government says, states, you have to do this, and then the states have to come up with plans and strategies for how to comply. As I think we've already talked about with the talks lecture, and we'll get into with our air quality and water quality lectures later on. That doesn't mean that magically everybody is in compliance. In fact, Colorado has been out of compliance with ozone standards for a long time, but at least there are mechanisms in place and an agreement for a certain number of pollutants in different media, air and water and soil, what those standards are. And then in many cases, states are have the authority to set more stringent standards. And so California, for example, in many, many cases has standards that are more stringent, more protective than the federal government. And so oftentimes what other states will do is either sort of adopt the, just say we're just going with the federal standard, or adopt the California standard. And so I do not expect you to fully digest and there's no quiz on this, but just to kind of show you, right? These are all. This is the acronym salad that is our federal government. So some of these I can tell you what they stand for. Other ones I would have to look them up as well. But the idea being, right, there's really a lot of federal agencies, and then sub initiatives and groups within those, dealing with all kinds of, trying to I mean, the environment is everywhere, right? So we have everything from the Department of Labor with OSHA, HUD is Housing and Urban Development, it does lead hazard control. So lots and lots of agencies in charge, which is great in some ways, right? That first, that Ruckelshaus quote, right? We're really doing this comprehensive approach to not just looking at environment sort of from this one aspect, but all over. As you can imagine, this also gets really complicated and challenging, for example, for regulated entities to know, right, how do I comply with the different standards, and who do I have to deal with if I'm building a new business or factory. You might have to be sort of grappling with multiple different ones, pieces of this puzzle. And then, of course, if we get down to the state level, then we've got, kind of a similar, usually not quite as complex, but a similar configuration at those local state and local levels as well. So this is just another way of looking at sort of some key timeline of federal environmental policies. So again, starting with Nixon and some of the really key. So again, apologies for all of the acronyms. But yeah, so a lot of the Clean Air, Clean Water Act at the start, over time, and again, I think what we really want to really noting is that for quite a while, right, we're seeing some fairly significant action under both Democratic and Republican presidents. And this also is showing which parties had control of the legislature, the House and the Senate, during these different periods. So in the current era, there's been some kind of wild swings in the level, the sort of commitment to and movement towards or away from environmental action. So during the Trump administration, there was a very big push towards rolling back federal environmental health regulations. According to this report, Trump rolled back more than 125 environmental safeguards. And that was really sort of the stated goal, was to, and again, a lot of it was sort of under this what do I want to say? The rationale was that all of this kind of sea of regulations makes it really hard for business to operate, and we need to get government out of the way. And so, they did, to some, with some success. The courts played a big role in blocking some of the more major actions that were taken. One of the big actions at the sort of global scale was pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement that was negotiated right at the end of Obama's presidency. And
then
so then we have
emphasizing yet again that with Biden's presidency, the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction, and this commitment to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords.
Whoa, this is weird.
And taking more.
I'm talking, and then I'm talking again somewhere else.
The climate crisis has really been front of the federal agenda.
Is someone on?
And as a big important part of that, Justice 40 is one.
Whoa, that's so weird.
An executive action that is committing to environmental justice and
Oh, I think I know what must be going on. So this was like I record these. This was a recorded lecture and I must have had like a narration. Let me just make sure that I don't have any narrations playing because that's too weird to be hearing myself talking. No, that's so strange. Um, Not animations. Oh, okay. Play narrations. Okay, we're not going to play narrations. We're not going to use timings. Okay. You're back. Um, okay, so then when with the election of President Biden, we have sort of a swing in back into the other direction of rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. Really working to undo a lot of the sort of rollbacks that Trump had put in place or attempted to put in place, and really making climate and sort of linked environmental issues one of the sort of pillars of his administration's objectives. And I'll talk a little bit more in a second about Justice 40. I think it is important to emphasize the scale and impact, which we are really only beginning to see of the Biden administration's climate policies. This particular publication refers to this triple whammy of, we hear a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act. That was kind of part 3, actually, of this set of 3 major policies that the Biden administration put in place, starting with the CHIPS Act, which some refer to as the brains of this operation. So what the CHIPS Act does is dedicates billions of dollars towards research and development to accelerate innovation in emerging clean energy technologies. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, so right, of course, coming into at the outset of the Biden presidency, we were right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And so this was both a way of investing in communities to help rebuild our, sort of that build back better after after the pandemic, and putting money into building the infrastructure that we would need to launch some of those cleaner techs. And finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, and this is really the engine. It's an enormous amount of investment, and so what this graph is showing is sort of the investment in climate action and in clean tech that our country has made over time, and you can just see how massive this is, and also that a lot of this funding started in 2022. And so, for example, I am working with Adams County to put in a proposal to help them engage with some communities and invest in climate action in Adams County. We're going to be putting that proposal in the beginning of November. So all of this is really just starting to roll out, but it's a massive investment that we're going to see playing out over time, with, of course, some caveats that depending on where our country chooses to go from here, that may affect how much of this investment actually gets doled out and how it happens. We're also in an era of policy through executive action. So because we are have been in a place for a while where in a lot of ways, our government doesn't function at the federal level. It's very hard to pass legislation with very closely divided legislature, and really a huge shift in terms of this movement away from bipartisanship. And so we're in a moment now where environmentalism at the federal level is really a democratic goal and objective, and heavily opposed by the Republican Party. And so that makes it really hard to pass major legislation in many cases, which again, I think is a testament to sort of how remarkable something like the Inflation Reduction Act is. But in the absence of other legislation, both parties have really turned to making policy through executive order or through executive order. So this is just sort of some examples of various different executive orders that that Biden passed or issued during his presidency. And this environmental justice for all is also, again, called the Justice 40 Act. This is a commitment to spend 40% or to have 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments, including things like that Inflation Reduction Act, to flow to disadvantaged communities. What does that mean? This map here has actually sort of codified and defined what a disproportionately impacted community is. And so therefore 40% of Inflation Reduction Act dollars must be spent in areas that show up as gray on that map. And that is again, a fairly substantial commitment to acknowledging our history of environmental injustice and putting our money where our mouth is in terms of making progress. One of the assigned readings today is this report from Resources for the Future that sort of talks through some of the successes and challenges in implementing this Justice 40 initiative. Okay, so in terms of this rapid history and again the moment that we're in, I would say some of the good news, and we'll look at this a little bit more in a minute, is that we have achieved a lot through the action that we've taken so far. So we have substantially cleaner air, cleaner water, and some really promising climate action finally, which again, we're really just seeing the beginnings of in a lot of cases. Of course, there are still challenges. As we'll talk about in a minute, all of these laws sort of have some gaps, some blind spots, some things that they didn't necessarily foresee. And again, because that momentum and that bipartisan support for environmental action has eroded so severely, these laws have not kept up and have not been updated to adequately to deal with our evolving sets of risks and challenges. Whether we're talking about, and there's another lecture, asynchronous lecture this week on occupational health law and policy, which is a pretty egregious example of some really good things that we've done, but very underfunded and huge gaps in terms of how workers are protected, for example. So there's still challenges in getting that environmental justice and environmental racism addressed and implemented. And I'd say, one of the biggest things, like a huge topic, is that we have these environmental laws that attack air pollution, water pollution, soil and hazardous waste in these different silos. And our entire system of environmental governance is not really well equipped to say, how do these things work together, right? So me as a person living in a place, I am breathing the air and drinking the water, and I'm exposed in various different ways. And, even if maybe all of those are sort of at their standards, what's that cumulative impact, right, of being exposed to all of those different things? And so there is a lot of, I would say, agreement that we need systems that address things in a more cumulative way. And yet that's still not really how our systems are set up. Finally, I hope a takeaway from this is that elections matter. You have seen in the modern era how drastically different the approaches to environmental policy are. I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that a second Trump presidency would be even more catastrophic for environmental for environmental policy and environmental outcomes. So I'm going to put this up here for a second. Encourage everybody to vote. This is a great resource for other friends, family members, anyone else who maybe doesn't have the information they need to be a voter. I highly encourage you. I think Colorado is, if those of you who are new to Colorado, we are somewhat unique in that I just got my ballot the other day. I'm going to leisurely fill it out and then drop it off. I'm actually going to do it really quickly because the sooner I do it, the sooner people stop bugging me to get my ballot in. But yeah, so it's real easy for us here in Colorado. For those of you who have friends, family members, maybe you're still registered to vote in another home state, do that. It's one of the most important things that we can do to be a part of continuing to move our country in the right direction. I had dinner with my my grandmother the other night, who leans more conservative, but what she told me is that a piece of advice that she got recently is that your vote is not a Valentine. So you don't have to be in love with the person that you're voting for. But I think we have a fairly clear choice in this election. And so, yeah, that's my 2 cents on that matter. I'll take a breath for a second. Any questions before we move on to sort of some of the building blocks of getting a little bit more into the weeds on why we regulate and how we regulate? All right. So again, I think what we just went over is that, the 1970s sort of moved in this direction from from really just letting industry kind of run the show to having a government agency that was in charge of telling industry what it could and couldn't do. And Pete Andrews has a really great book on sort of, again, walking through this history of environmental policy in the US, and just noting how really revolutionary it was in a lot of ways to establish a national agency that actually was going to yeah, like say no to some of the things industry wanted to do. And so what I want to do now is to kind of go to my roots. I was trained as an economist, and dispel maybe some myths or some talking points that folks may hear about what an economic approach to environmental policy might lead us to think or to do. And so, I think a lot of times we will still kind of hear again these refrains that, we live in a free market capitalist society. And what that means is that we just need to let businesses do their own thing, and they're going to produce the most efficient outcomes. They've got these incentives to compete and to innovate. And part of that comes from this really old white guy, Adam Smith, right? The theory of moral sentiments in the 1750s. This is a quote from him, which the piece that many of us may have heard is this invisible hand, the invisible hand of the market, okay? And this is the full quote, which I won't read out. But the idea, right, is that when we let a free market do its thing, we have buyers and sellers, and we have multiple people competing, and that even without necessarily needing to step in and say, oh no, like this would be more efficient, the market is going to lead to sort of this optimal outcome. So what does optimal mean? The way that this has been sort of rephrased in sort of neoclassical economics is that under certain assumptions, competitive markets will lead to the most efficient allocation of resources. So this is really talking about efficiency, for one thing. It's not necessarily talking about equity, okay? But it's saying that there's not going to be $5 bills lying around on the sidewalk. The free market creates incentives to use resources in an efficient way. The problem is those assumptions that go into that, okay? And in reality, there are lots of situations where real world markets violate those assumptions of that first welfare theorem. I've listed some of them here. Some of those are non-competitive markets. So monopolies where we only have one seller of a good, where we have information asymmetries. So for example, right, a seller of used cars might know something about the quality of that car and its history and how long it's actually going to run, that the buyer, the seller puts a shiny coat of paint on it, maybe looks great. The buyer doesn't have that information. That's going to create some inefficiencies as well. Principal agent problems I'm not going to go into. Two of the ones that are really relevant for environmental issues are what's called externalities and what's called public goods. So I'll explain each of those. Externalities are situations where there's a cost or benefit imposed on parties that are external to the market transaction for a good, not the buyer or seller. All right, what does that actually mean? Economists love widgets. Nobody knows what a widget is, but we always talk about buying and selling widgets as sort of a generic good. So you've got a factory that's producing widgets, and maybe the widget costs $5 for the factory to produce. You've got this guy who loves widgets, and he's willing to pay about $10, up to $10 for one. So they're going to work something out in the market. They're going to come to an agreement on a price, and the customer is going to be happy. The widget maker is going to be happy. They're likely going to make a small profit. If you've got lots of widget factories, their profits will be lower, which is again kind of actually efficient for society. And that's where we're at. The problem is that what if, see these little smokestacks coming out of my widget factory, we can attach a dollar value to the pollution and the health impacts that producing widgets cost. And maybe it costs society $1 to treat cases of widget lung disease that are produced by, that are attributable to the widget factory. And so this is an externality. This is a cost that neither the buyer nor the seller is taking into consideration when they are making decisions about how much to buy or sell. So that's an externality. A public good, we can think about goods having various different characteristics, including whether they are excludable or non-excludable. An excludable good is one where we can kind of keep some people from using it in theory. Non-excludable means that it's sort of open to everyone. And then rival, they're somewhat different concepts. Rival goods means that if I own this water bottle or coffee mug, nobody else can own this coffee mug, okay? Whereas non-rival means that we kind of all own it, and it doesn't, it's actually less about ownership. It's that my consumption makes it less available for others if it's rival, and if it's non-rival, it doesn't. Okay, those are kind of weird. Let's talk about some specific examples, okay? So most of the things that we buy and sell in markets are private goods. A car is rival. So once I own the car, it's just mine, and I can keep other people from using my car, okay? If I eat a bag of Doritos, that's just mine. Club goods are excludable and non-rival. So what this means is that I can, for example, a movie theater, right? If we're all up here watching a movie, the fact that Lexi is watching the movie doesn't change Liam's ability to also watch the movie. So it's non-rival, but we can put a door on the room and say other people can't come in and watch this movie. So those are what we call club goods. If folks have heard about the tragedy of the commons, it's referring to this kind of a good where it is non-excludable. And I'm going to put an asterisk on that, meaning that we have decided, right? So people aren't excluded. We could actually, in theory, make rules that exclude people from doing this, but we haven't. And so when we haven't done that, we've set something up and it's operating as a common pool resource. Something like groundwater is a fantastic example here in Colorado. We have big aquifers in the southern parts of the state that, right, if somebody's taking water out of that aquifer, it is not available for anybody else, right? So it is rival, but if we're letting anybody who wants to take water out of that aquifer, then it is non-excludable, or we've decided to have it be non-excludable. So the problems here that, right, if multiple people kind of have this incentive to take as much as they can, we can have a situation where we're ultimately sort of leading to the collapse of that resource. And finally, public goods. Public goods are ones that are non-rival and non-excludable. So the air we breathe, right? I can breathe as much air as I want, and it doesn't affect anybody else's ability to breathe air. That doesn't mean that what I do doesn't affect the quality of the air, right? But in terms of air as a resource source that I can breathe, national defense. Once we have said, we are setting up this system of national defense, all of us who live within the nation that is being protected are protected by that national defense, and similarly public parks. So the problem that we run into is that the market does really great with private goods. And it's actually, doing an okay job with club goods. Common pool resources are a huge problem that government, that sort of provides a rationale for some type of intervention, whether that's, small societies setting up some rules for who can access, or a government system. And public goods, absolutely. No individual has the right incentives to provide public goods for everyone, since they're only deriving a small part of the benefit from it. So based on economics alone, the fundamentals of economics that I learned in grad school, there is a strong rationale for government involvement in society, and specifically in situations that affect environmental health. So when we have externalities or public goods, free markets are not producing efficient outcomes. They are producing too much pollution and too little of those public goods that we all rely on. And correcting externalities and providing public goods are key functions of government. These are things that government should absolutely be doing. So the takeaway from that, limiting pollution of air and water are justified under economic theory, among many other philosophies, right? So economics is not the only thing, but again, because these economic arguments and this sort of free market capitalist thinking are so fundamental, I think it's very important to emphasize that in that system, government regulation is absolutely justified and recommended, if we're just talking basic principles here. Okay, so then how do we actually regulate? We can do command and control regulation, which is where regulators set standards and apply them uniformly to a broad category of sources, or market-based types of regulation, where regulators set economic incentives that encourage polluters to reduce pollution. So I'll give you some examples here. Ambient standards set the amount of a pollutant that can be present in the environment. So as an example, the Clean Air Act's National Ambient Air Quality Standards are one instance of an ambient standard. So that those say the maximum amount of ozone that is, that we're going to allow is X. And so then all states and local areas have to comply with those standards. We can also set emission standards that say this is the amount of pollution that you can actually emit if you're, for example, a factory or a new source. Vehicle emission standards are an example of that. And then there's also technology-based standards that might say you have to use the best available control technology to control the pollution that you're emitting. There are some key advantages to command and control policies. They're pretty clear in terms of what regulated entities have to do. And it's more easy to monitor. Are you doing what you were supposed to? Some disadvantage, it can be costly for regulators to gather all that information and to go around and see, is everybody doing the thing that, is everybody using the technology they're supposed to use? Who's emitting more than they're supposed to, et cetera. If it's a technology standard and you say you have to use this, but then something else comes out that might do that job more efficiently, unless the regulation says you're going to get benefited in some way for going above and beyond, it may not create an incentive to do that. And then, so if we've got older and newer factories, and some of them maybe can clean themselves up less expensively than others. In this world, we're sort of saying everyone has to do the same thing or everyone has to comply in the same way. And so it may not get us to the least cost solution. In contrast, we have market-based approaches. So we have taxes or fees. And these do, so in cases where we have those externalities, right? What, again, the way the sort of the econs speak for what these taxes and fees do is internalize the externality. So they make the producer suddenly take into account those external costs that production is imposing on society when it's making decisions. So carbon taxes, which again have not been formally adopted or imposed in the US, but have in Europe and places in Canada, are an example of this. This is an example from British Columbia's carbon tax, which is now a few decades old. Tradable permits kind of say, okay, as a unit for the entire country, for example, we're not going to emit any more than X of this pollutant. It might allocate permits across different firms and then allow those firms to trade and say, okay, so now back to that situation where if somebody can reduce their pollution more efficiently or at lower cost than others, then maybe they say, you know what, actually, I don't need this many of my permits. I'm going to sell them to somebody else and reduce my pollution more. And another entity that has a harder time or would be more costly for them to reduce their emission, maybe because of the types of products they're producing or because of the technologies they're using, can continue to emit more pollution. If we have a situation where a unit of pollution here or here is exactly the same, which, for example, is the case for carbon, for CO2 from a climate perspective, it's really like global greenhouse gas emissions that we care about. However, if we have a situation where, for example, firms are emitting CO2 and also other pollutants that affect local areas, these tradable permits can lead to pollution hotspots because maybe some of those older, dirtier firms are located, for example, in lower income communities, and they're going to continue polluting more. So there's been quite a bit of skepticism about tradable permits. And again, I think in theory and with certain limits, they can work well. They worked quite well for this. This was the acid rain problem that we had due to high emissions of sulfur dioxide. And so there was a tradable permit system set up for that under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which was quite effective at reducing that pollution. And finally, liability is a market-based solution. So this, so basically, taking people to court, making them pay when they've caused harm, can be another way of sort of imposing those costs or having inducing firms to take into account the costs that they may be imposing on other folks. So there was a massive oil spill in 1989, and it was sort of a landmark case in terms of the fines that that Exxon was forced to pay to account for its various different environmental damages. So market-based approaches can deter, can lead people to the most cost-effective ways of reducing emissions and provide incentives for continual innovation, right? Because if you're paying a tax for every unit of pollution you produce, then each unit that you reduce helps you avoid paying that tax. So it creates this incentive for innovation. Can be less burdensome on regulators if they don't have to sort of go out and measure how much or what each individual person is doing, what technologies they're using, et cetera. Taxes are often strongly opposed by regulated entities, and as we talked about, these don't necessarily, I would say, overall economics. Again, thinks a lot about efficiency and not necessarily as much on equity. So is it fair that we have, polluting entities over here and non-polluting entities over there? If the total amount of pollution is lower, do we care? probably, right? From a, if we approach this from an equity and sort of moral point of view. So, which of these approaches is best? It depends on who you ask. Economists and others have strongly advocated for using more market-based approaches, but inertia and opposition for the public and industry have led to continued reliance on command and control approaches for much of environmental policy. Okay, we have 15 minutes left in class. I actually am just going to go pretty quickly through these Clean Air and Clean Water Act because I do want to spend a little bit of time on our Flint case study. And of course, all of these slides will be provided to you. We also do have upcoming lectures on air and water, and I think we'll touch on some of these regulations in there. So the Clean Air Act, this is some of the sort of origins of air pollution legislation. Again, going back to that environmental decade, the Clean Air Act of 1970 is really where a lot of the structure of our current air pollution regulations come in. There were some key revisions in 1977 and 1990. Here are some of the key elements. As I mentioned before, it required the EPA to establish these what are called NACs, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And it's important to note that these focused on 6 what are called criteria pollutants, okay? And they're listed here. So nothing else, none of the other pollutants that are in the that are emitted are subject to these national ambient air quality standards. There are other provisions that look at, for example, hazardous air pollutants. And it's important, yeah, that these standards were set based on human health risk without regard to cost. And then, as I said before, states were required then to adopt these enforceable plans to meet the national air quality standards. The Clean Air Act focuses a lot on point sources. So that's sort of a single, like a power plant, like the thing that widget factory, right? That's a point source. And automobiles also in the realm of what was regulated. And then, for all of the other things that were not criteria air pollutants, there was a list of hazardous air pollutants, and EPA was supposed to develop risk-based standards for control of these pollutants. So in 1990, some of the amendments, the definition of a non-attainment area, tightening auto emission standards, revising air toxic sessions, so trying to get a little bit outside of those 6 criteria pollutants in a more robust way, that acid rain control program that I mentioned before, and a few other things. The Montreal Protocol to phase out ozone depleting chemicals. So again, the good ozone that's high up in the atmosphere that protects us from the sun's UV light. We had a major problem with chemicals that we were using that were depleting that ozone. And so part of what the 1990 amendments were doing, we're trying to tackle that problem. And so, yeah, the kind of nuts and bolts, again, these state implementation plans are really the mechanism for if a place is out of compliance, how is the state or the local area going to come into compliance with those standards. And in terms of enforcement, there are a number of different sort of sticks that the federal government can wield to encourage states to get into to come into enforcement. They can kind of limit funding that comes to states for different things like highways, or I'm not sure what they ban on air quality grants, specifically what that refers to. And then citizen suits. And so this is an example of that, actually. Several environmental organizations, including Green Latinos, who I may have mentioned before, I work quite a bit with them, have sued Suncor, the oil refinery located in Commerce City, over its repeated violations of the Clean Air Act. And that lawsuit was, I think filed it, I think in August, so it's still going. No outcome of that yet. And then these hazardous air pollutants, again, I think we touched a little bit on those in the toxicology lecture. We'll come back to some of those in our air pollution lecture as well. So yeah, I mean, overall, our air has gotten quite a bit cleaner as a result of the Clean Air Act. So the 6 criteria air pollutants have decreased by 70% between, or they did between 1970 and 2025. The air toxics data are limited, but most indications are that these decrease as well, and partly that's because even if they're not regulated, they are often co-emitted, right, by similar entities, and so both some of the measures that are in place to address some of those hazardous air pollutants, and then as sort of a co-benefit of addressing the 6 criteria air pollutants, we've also seen reductions in some other pollutants as well. And then, as I mentioned, the acid rain problem was quite effectively addressed through these programs as well. This is a plot of some of the different trends in air pollutants over time, and we see many of them, trending very strongly downward. These are the number of days reaching unhealthy for sensitive groups. So also seeing those going down. Lots of data. So saying by 2020, the EPA projected that the Clean Air Act had prevented more than 30,000 cases of premature mortality, 200,000 heart attacks, 17 million lost workdays, and 2.4 million asthma attacks. So I think quite a substantial achievement. And of course, not that our work is done. There's more to do. In terms of the water legislation, again, I'm actually just going to go through those, jump ahead to be able to spend a little bit of time on Flint before we get to the end of class. So the Flint water crisis. Flint was once known as Vehicle City, home to General Motors car factory. Economic decline in Flint began in the 1980s with GM downsizing. And in 2011, this is really where sort of things started to go wrong for, laying the groundwork for the crisis that we're talking about. The state of Michigan took over Flint's finances and said, Flint, you can't control your own finances anymore. They appointed an emergency manager type person. And as part of that, in kind of looking at, okay, here are the finances, the water supply, right? The money available to kind of provide water services was already in deficit. But instead, officials used money to cover shortfalls in the general fund. So took even more money away from that to cover shortfalls in other areas. So in order to reduce now it's like, okay, well, we don't have enough money to pay for water. And so to really address that financial issue, the city switched its water source and began getting water from the Flint River. The problem actually wasn't as much the quality of the Flint River's water as it was that it wasn't treated with an anti-corrosive agent. And so the fact that the Flint had lead pipes, and treating that water with an anti-corrosive agent would have allowed the water to travel through those lead pipes without leaching the lead from the pipes. But it failed. But the city failed to, not the city, the authorities who were in charge failed to do that, which was in violation of part of the EPA's lead and copper rule. So the health impacts were fairly immediate and obvious if to those who were looking for it. I will. I'm not going to have time to play that. I have embedded in here this video. This is actually a 12-minute video, so we're not going to watch it in class today, but it's really well done. It's from the National Resources Defense Council. So you worked for them, right? Nice. And kind of goes through, has some really good stories from folks who were affected, and ultimately sued the government over this. Go to the next. So, so what ended up happening again is that because this water wasn't treated correctly and was traveling through the lead pipes, it caused large these lead levels in the water to spike, and that then showed up actually in the blood lead levels of children, for example, who were being treated at local clinics. Last year, so I'm actually just going to skip ahead here to Dr. Mona. Last year, Dr. Mona Tisha Ada, who's written a really wonderful book called What the Eyes Don't See. She is one of the heroes of the Flint story. She was a pediatrician who started, monitoring the lead levels in the children that her clinic was treating, and really blowing the whistle on what was happening. And it took a lot of persistence, like even with, hard data showing like, look, this is this huge spike. A lot of the science was dismissed for a long time. And she actually came to campus last year. It was like a campus read for What the Eyes Don't See. And she came and gave a talk, which was really, really great. So I think I will just, highlight, there's again, materials in here, which I will encourage you to kind of go through on your own, including a couple of good videos. But I think what this case highlighted was a few different things. One is, a very clear instance of environmental racism. Flint is a majority Black city. I think there's a lot of, I think if this crisis had occurred in a more affluent, whiter city, well, even the origins of the crisis really kind of go back to taking control out of the local government's hands even, and imposing these decisions, which I think there's a lot of negligence all along the way. So at the state level, this emergency manager's decision to rely on rely on the unsafe Flint River water and then fail to treat it. The governor's office did not respond to complaints. And then, I think even the federal government and the EPA were very slow to act and enforce this. So some policy responses. So in October 2015, after this evidence emerged, and people were starting to take it seriously, the EPA established a safe drinking water task force. In January of 2016, President Obama signed an emergency declaration. And so this was sort of, the federal government finally taking some action and doing its own monitoring of the lead levels. In March of 2017, the EPA awarded $100 million to Michigan to support water infrastructure improvements. So again, some of the sort of the root causes, well, lots of root causes, but one of the most immediate problems was that there were so many lead pipes, and not only in Flint, but in a lot of other places across the country. And so, this was good news that this, the money was awarded. But as of April of this year, the work to replace all of those pipes was still not done. And in the process of replacing those pipes, some homes were damaged. And so there are at least 2,000 homes that need repairs for those property damages. So it's really an ongoing issue. And again, the Flint is sort of one instance of that. But I do want to just sort of end with, again, it's not all gloom and doom. I think there are some really good lessons that have come out of that. And this is what Dr. Mona, when she was here last year, was really highlighting, is a program that she set up that is called RX Kids. And it provides, so we sort of said that reparations word earlier. Richard Nixon said that reparations word earlier today. This is sort of like, what might that actually look like, right? So the example or the mechanism here is that it's basically a unconditional cash payment for new moms and their babies in the first year of their life. There's been a lot of evidence to show that there's this really massive drop off in income at a time of kids' lives where they're really expensive and families really need that extra cash. And so, you know, looking at how to set up programs that are intervening on those social determinants of health and addressing those root causes of poverty as one way of, you know, and I think, again, a lot of the rationale is that these effects, for example, of being exposed to lead at a very young age are very detrimental to children's development, and children can be resilient and recover from that with the right supports. And so part of the rationale here is giving these communities more resources and supports to help with that recovery and addressing, again, it's not just that, you know, not just the lead exposure, it's also the exposure to poverty and racism and all of these different things. And so trying to intervene on that in a holistic way. And so this video kind of talks through that program and all of that. So
we hope that
I won't show that today, but that is where I'll wrap up. Thanks all.